history fans! Welcome to Module 7, the video lecture over the road to Civil War. Full disclosure, right up front, this one is a little bit longer, it's a little bit more involved. I don't know, man, the Civil War is complicated. So I am going to go through this really kind of fast, just to get through it all. But again, as a reminder, pause it. Rewind the video. Watch it 2 or 3 times if you need to. That's the good thing about this. So, without further ado, let's jump. Buckle your seatbelts. Let's talk about the antebellum period, the road to the Civil War. Antebellum, A-N-T-E-B-E-L-L-U-M. There's your college level word for the day. Latin. Ante means before, bellum means war. So antebellum, period before the war. To understand the period before the war, we first need to understand the Old South society. How was the South organized before the Civil War? It's all about cotton. Cotton is king. There is an increase in the demand for cotton worldwide, which coincides with these three things. The invention of the cotton gin, the end of the international slave trade, and all of those internal improvements that we talked about last time when we were talking about the Jacksonian era. So the cotton gin is a machine that separates the bolls of cotton, the actual like cotton ball that you might buy, from the seeds. Before, this was very hard to do because cotton bolls are really prickly, and so they hurt people's hands. It had to be done by hand, and so that took the slaves a long time to do. But after the invention of the cotton gin, it's possible for a single slave to just dump in a whole load of cotton, and the gin spits out the good stuff and keeps the bad stuff, which means you can grow a lot more cotton. 1808, the end of the international slave trade. We talked about this one before too, how there's no more African slaves coming in to the country, coming in from Africa, but there's a lot of movement of slaves internally. The internal slave trade explodes. So a lot more slaves being sold throughout the South. The 1830s, all of those internal improvements. If there's a bunch of slaves there and they're able to process more cotton than they ever have before, and all of that cotton now has very easy ways to get to new markets by roads or by canals or by railroads or what have you, shipping, if we're thinking about overseas markets, then expansion of the cotton industry is going to explode, and that's what we see. Cotton is huge. By the 1850s, cotton is the dominant export of the United States. By the 1850s, whoops, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. By the 1850s, 3/4 of the world's cotton comes from the American South. Let that sink in. 3/4 of the world's cotton comes from the American South. The American economy depends on Southern cotton. That's where the money is. Now also by the 1850s, 80% of the white Southern population doesn't own slaves, because that's where the money is. And most white people in the South, roughly 80%, are really kind of poor, and they can't afford to buy a slave. And they know that by the 1850s, those people know that if they don't have a slave by now, they're never going to have one. Slaves are expensive. So then the question becomes, we know that 15 years later, there's a civil war over this idea of slavery. Why, if so many people don't have slaves, why do they care? Why do people cling to slavery? The answer is because slavery is a unifying force. Slavery is a unifying force. It is an economic institution. King Cotton requires a massive labor source. Slaves represent wealth. That's where the money is. Money is in slaves. Money is in cotton. It's also a racial institution. Remember, we've talked a lot in this class about how black equals inferior, black equals slave. Slavery offers white Southern Americans a psychological wage. No matter how poor and how ignorant and how backwards you as a white person are, You're always going to be 1,000 times better than even the most well-educated, wealthiest free black man. No matter how poor, how ignorant, how backwards a white person is, he's always socially better than even a free, well-educated, very wealthy black person. A psychological wage. So losing either this economic institution or this racial institution is a loss of liberty for the white Southerners. They're either losing their money, it's hitting them in the pocketbooks where it hurts, or it's losing the way that they think about themselves and their place in the world, and a way to make themselves feel better. So again, think about, leave a space in your notes maybe, or draw some arrows in your notebook. Think about those primary documents that we'll read later in the module to get a sense of what life was like for slaves in the Old South. We'll talk about slaves being sold, families being separated, women being raped, on and on and on. It's a fun topic. Kidding. That was sarcasm. So here's kind of the complicated part. The politics of slavery and the failure of compromise. Also think of this last section, this rather large section, as a worsening crisis. It's a crisis. The tensions are rising. Every year there is a new event, a new issue, a new problem, and tensions rise higher and higher and higher. The North versus the South, the idea of keeping slavery versus the idea of getting rid of it in whatever manner. Every year there's a new problem. The stress gets higher every year. And people in America keep trying to compromise, keep trying to put off this situation, and it only gets worse. So let's talk about how it gets worse. Think of this, again, this module is called The Road to Civil War. It takes a long time to walk down that road. The politics of slavery and the failure of compromise, this really starts over when the question of slavery and that idea of manifest destiny combine. So last time we were talking about manifest destiny, territorial expansion into the American West. Now we're talking about a question of slavery, whether or not slavery should extend to the territories. And this becomes an issue for the North and the South. The North, for their part, is convinced of a slave conspiracy. They think that it's a massive scam that the South is pulling. And they've got some pretty logical arguments to back up that claim. First, they point to the 3/5 compromise. They say that the 3/5 compromise lets the South have more power in government than they really deserve. The 3/5 compromise means that the South can use part of their slave population for representation in the House. They have more representatives than they really deserve. The 3/5 compromise also affects the Electoral College, the process by which presidents are elected. Electoral College votes are calculated in this manner. The number of senators, which is the same for everybody, 2, plus the number of representatives in the House. So if they have more representatives, then if Southern states have more representatives than they really deserve, then they have more Electoral College votes than they really deserve. And Northern states, Northern agitators, are able to point to the fact that the first 9 out of the 15 presidents are from the South, mostly Virginia, a major slave state. So the North becomes convinced of a slave conspiracy. This is a political issue. It starts to spill over into this question of manifest destiny. Should slavery extend to the territories? Because there is a procedure in place by which territories become states. So what is that procedure, right? A territory is originally defined and created. Once it reaches a certain population, they are supposed to write a constitution and apply for admittance into the Union, and then they become a state. That's the process. Well, the issue is that if a territory allowed slavery, it had always become a slave state. Whereas if a territory did not allow slavery, it had always become a free state. Pretty logical. That's pretty obvious. And so in the early half of the 1800s, this is not a problem for the North. The North likes that. And so if we're thinking about this map, which we saw in our image analysis, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 establishes that line at the 3630 parallel. And it says that any new states that enter the Union above this line are going to be free states, and any new states that are below the line are going to become slave states. The North likes the Missouri Compromise because in 1820, the U.S.-Mexican War hadn't happened yet, and so a lot of this territory did not belong to Mexico, did not yet belong to the United States. Mexico was there. There's not a lot of new states available, not a lot of new land to create new states that would go slave. But then the U.S.-Mexican War happens in the 1840s, and all of a sudden, all of this land is opened up. There's a lot of possible new states that would go slave. Northern politicians don't like the Compromise of 1820 anymore, and so they abolish it. Politicians agree to abolish it with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which we also talked about a little bit in our image analysis for this module. Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 leads to Bleeding Kansas, when pro-slavery factions attack Lawrence, Kansas, the territorial capital, kill a lot of people, burn a printing press, an attack on First Amendment rights. And John Brown, the famous abolitionist, retaliates in a big way, to say the least. Now here's where we'll go kind of fast. The politics of slavery, the election of 1856. Here's our electoral map for the election of 1856. We see the creation in 1856 of a new political party, the Republican Party. This is when the Republican Party is created. The Republican Party, brand spanking new party, they only have a single issue, and that is anti-slavery. Now, sidebar, there is a difference between abolition and anti-slavery. Abolition is the idea of abolishing slavery. Abolish. Abolition. Get it? Yeah. So abolishing slavery. Cut it out wholesale. Immediately. It's gone. No more slavery anywhere. Abolish it. Abolition. On the other hand, there are some people, again, generally in the North, but not always, who favor anti-slavery, which says, let's just stop slavery from spreading. Slavery's in the South. It's entrenched. We kind of need it if we're thinking about economics. It's not going to go anywhere, but that doesn't mean that we have to let it spread. It's like a sickness. It's like a quarantine, right? We want to quarantine slavery. Don't let it spread. We want to keep it in the South. That's anti-slavery. Now, the Republican Party is a party of anti-slavery. They just want to contain slavery in the South. Don't let it spread to the Western states. That's their belief, that's their platform. Southerners tend to ignore that. Southerners tend to get panicked and think that the Republicans are all abolitionists and they're going to come and steal their property, i.e. their slaves. That's not what's going on. Republicans, anti-slavery. So regardless, let's get back to our electoral map here. Election of 1856, Republicans, brand spanking new party, but they do very, very well for a brand spanking new party. All of these little pink states here in the North go Republican. The Republicans do well, too well, in the South's opinion. The election in Pennsylvania, this state right here, is very, very close. Now we see on the map that Pennsylvania has 27 electoral college votes. That's a lot of votes. If the Republicans had won the election in Pennsylvania, which they almost did, it was a very close election. If they had won the election and Pennsylvania and any other state, it doesn't even matter which one, they would have won the presidency. And that makes the southern states very panicked. People who know how to read that electoral map get worried, because that means that it is entirely possible for a northern anti-slavery candidate to win the presidency without a single southern vote. A northern abolitionist / anti-slavery candidate can carry the presidency without having to listen to the South. Maybe the South isn't as important to national politics as they used to be. This worries Southerners. 1856. The next year, a new crisis. Dred Scott decision. So we probably read about this a little bit, but just to sum up, Dred Scott, this man pictured here, he's a slave in Missouri, but his master took him to Illinois and Minnesota, where they lived for several years. And Illinois and Minnesota are free states. And so Dred Scott argues that since he moved to a free state, that made him free. He sues for his freedom. The court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And interestingly, the Supreme Court refuses to hear it, but they still send down a ruling. Right? Hundreds, if not thousands, of court cases get sent to the Supreme Court every year. The Supreme Court can't hear them all. They pick and choose which ones to hear. They don't hear Dred Scott's case, but they hand down a ruling anyway. They want to make a point. And this is their ruling. These three things. First and foremost, most simply, Scott is denied his freedom. He's not a free person. They say he's still a slave. And they go even further. The second thing, he's still a slave, and slaves aren't citizens. So he shouldn't even have been able to sue in the first place. And that's why they refuse to hear his case. They don't even stop there. They go even further. Number 3, the court says that no slave or descendant of a slave can be citizens. Why is that significant? Think about that for a minute. No slave or a descendant of a slave can ever be an American citizen. That's everybody. That's every African American person in the country will never be a citizen, according to this ruling in 1857 by the Supreme Court. So after this ruling is handed down, there's a very sectional reaction. The South loves it. This is a huge victory because it ensures, seemingly forever, that African American people will always be inferior, will always be slaves, will always be oppressed, will never be citizens. A massive victory for Southern slaveholders. The North is very, very angry, on the other hand. They hate this ruling. This is the worst possible thing that could have happened. They think now that the slave power conspiracy has left politics and is even corrupting the nation's highest court. The Supreme Court is supposed to be fair and just and honorable, and they're not seeing any of those things happen with this ruling. They see corruption. 1857. We're skipping over 1858 just for time's sake. If you're interested, Google Lecompton controversy. It's fun times. But 1859, John Brown's raid. A new year, a new crisis, right? We talked about John Brown with Bleeding Kansas before. He's a famous abolitionist, and he has this brilliant plan in October of 1859 that he, his sons, and his abolitionist followers are going to attack Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Harper's Ferry, Virginia is a federal arsenal. There's guns, there's ammo, there's all sorts of fun stuff that you would need to foment a rebellion. And that's what they're going to do. So John Brown and his sons and his followers attack the federal arsenal. They seize all the weaponry. They do get that done. But then it all starts to fall apart. John Brown thinks that after he's gotten the weapons and has started this rebellion, that all of the slaves in the surrounding area will hear about it. And they'll be inspired. And they'll be excited. And they will run away from their plantations and join him at the arsenal, and he will arm them, and they can move to the next town, to the next plantation over. And all of the slaves there at that plantation will hear about it and will run away and will join him, and they'll give them some arms and some guns, and they'll go to the next plantation, and he can just go from plantation to plantation, from town to town to town, building an army as he goes through the South, killing white slaveholders, burning plantations to the ground. He's advocating a race war. He wants to arm African American slaves. This is the South's worst fear realized. So, he doesn't get it done. Spoiler alert, there's no major race war. John Brown doesn't get to run through the South amok, like dominoes falling left and right. But after a day the Marines take over the guardhouse, Brown is arrested, he's tried for treason, and then he's hanged, killed, executed. And again, we see a sectional reaction. The North, the abolitionists, the anti-slavery faction, they see him as a hero. They see him as a martyr. This is a man who gave his all to the cause. The South, this is their worst fear. This is their biggest nightmare come true. They're afraid of race war. Remember, especially in places like South Carolina, white people are really outnumbered. In some counties, the population is 90% black. Whites are a minority in many places in the South, and so all of a sudden, if there's this large group of people that you have oppressed your entire life and their entire lives for generations upon generations, and all of a sudden they have guns and they're coming to attack you, you don't have much chance. You don't have much hope. Southerners panic. After John Brown's execution, it also comes out, word comes out that he had received funding from Northerners, and that makes Southerners angry. They think that the North has a conspiracy of their own. So, John Brown's raid in 1859, a major piece in the puzzle towards the road to Civil War, and it all comes to a head in 1860 with the election of Lincoln. 1860. This is a sectional election. There are 4 candidates. It's almost like there are 2 separate elections. Like there's an election in the North and an election in the South. There are no national parties at this time. So you can see this electoral map over here. What do we got? The Northern Democrats. Poor little Douglas. He gets Missouri. That's his home state. Even if you get no other home state, you got to get your home. Even if you get no other state, you got to get your home state. The Constitutional Union with Mr. Bell here. He gets 3 states. The border states. Those become important a year later. But most of the issue is between the Republicans in the North, the party of anti-slavery, the party of Abraham Lincoln, and all these green states in the bottom. The Southern Democrats with Breckinridge, who, nobody cared about. It happens. Think back to the last national election, 1856. We said that it was very obvious that a Northern candidate could win the presidency without a single Southern vote. And it happens. Lincoln does it. Lincoln gets all of the Electoral College votes that he needs to become president. He's not even on the ballot in Southern states. He's not even an option. Nobody votes for him because he's not on the ballot. But he wins the presidency. He's a minority president, but he wins the presidency. And when this happens, the South panics. They explode. Their little brains just cannot handle it. The South is convinced that Lincoln is an abolitionist. Now, we said that's not true. Republicans are anti-slavery. They just want to contain it. Abe Lincoln is not going to go into the South and steal people's property aka abolish slavery. He just wants to not let it spread. But regardless of the accurate story, what actually is happening, the South thinks that he's an abolitionist. They have to do something. They have to react. And so it all comes to a head at the end, or in the beginning, of 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter, which I'm sure you will read about in your textbook. The beginning of the Civil War. South Carolina has this federal fort called Fort Sumter. And this Fort Sumter federal fort in drastic need of resupply. They don't have food, they don't have medicine, but it's a federal fort, a Union fort, and so South Carolina, as a state, insists they leave. Now, okay, so Lincoln's in a pickle. If Lincoln lets them leave or makes them leave the fort, abandons the fort, then he implies that South Carolina has the right to boss the President of the United States, as if they were their own country. Now that's not true. He can't do that. But on the other hand, if he stays, if he orders the Union soldiers to stay in that fort, he's going to provoke a war. And so he doesn't want to do that either. So what does he do? Brilliantly, he does neither. He does neither one. He tells South Carolina that he's going to resupply the fort with food and medicine, not ammunition, not guns, not more soldiers, the way that South Carolina is worried. He's not going to threaten them in any way. There's no need to be threatened, just food and medicine. So now the ball's in South Carolina's court. Now South Carolina is in a pickle. What do? If they let Lincoln do that, then they imply that Lincoln has the right to boss them. And they don't think that that's true. So they bomb Fort Sumter. They attack Fort Sumter. The firing on Fort Sumter. Lincoln immediately reacts. He says this is an armed rebellion. He doesn't want to use the word civil war. He doesn't want to use the word war. So it's an armed rebellion. He calls out the military, and when he calls out the military, this provokes the rest of the South, all of those other southern states, into seceding from the Union as well with South Carolina. And there, in less than 30 minutes, look at that. We're so great. Pat yourself on the back at your computer. We have talked all about the road to civil war, this worsening crisis. Every year, a new problem. Every year, the tensions get higher until 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter. Lincoln has to react, and the Civil War begins. So thank you very much. I promise this is by far the last. We're almost done. We're almost done with the semester. Enjoy your way working through the rest of the module. I'll see you next time.